Now it is my pleasure to turn things over to our brilliant, kick-ass Director of Research, Angelo De Caro.
Thanks very much, Lana, and thanks for that wonderful speech. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you all, even if we're here virtually. My name is Angelo De Caro, and I'm the National Director of Research for Unifor. I'm here to moderate a super interesting panel discussion on our recently released roadmap for a fair, resilient, and inclusive economic recovery. It's about how workers can seize this challenging moment to rebuild an economy that is much better than it was before. I want to welcome all the sisters, brothers, and friends who are just tuning in now. It's great to have you with us. Just a note that on our panel today, there will be speakers in both English and French. If you're looking for French audio, please go to the Unifor Quebec webpage. And if you're on Facebook, you can always choose captions in the language of your choice. It wasn't that far into the current crisis that union leadership started to turn their attention toward what a post-COVID world could look like. Governments across Canada and Quebec were in the early stages of pulling together advisory boards and recovery committees. And as often is the case, these boards are comprised of conservative economic thinkers and business leaders, rarely involving unions and workers. Despite working very hard to help members navigate this crisis, which we are still doing today, we had to move quickly to put bold ideas into play, to force these ideas onto strategy tables, or risk having this COVID crisis steamroll workers now and in the future. We were one of the first groups in Canada to publish a comprehensive roadmap for post-COVID recovery. We solicited the views of members and local union leadership in a series of 10 webinars over the span of 1 week. We had input from our National Executive Board, from staff, and from leadership. This was a total union effort, or as good as it can get, I suppose, without being able to hold our regular Canadian and regional councils. I'm glad to say many of the ideas that we have put forth are actually now taking root in political discussions. You'll hear about some of these ideas on our panel today. But to kick things off, I want to bring in my research department colleague, Kaylee Thiessen, who played an exceptional role in helping to develop this paper. While each member of the research department, including Mike Yam, Navjeet Sidhu, Mark Holland, and Suna Sandbeck wrote key chapters, Kaylee is the one who really helped pull it all together, and I would say did a fabulous job. So welcome, Kaylee.
Thanks, Angelo, and shout out to the hundreds of people who helped put this paper together and all of the ideas on paper.
Right on, right on. So listen, I might be biased here, but I think this is a very excellent paper. Folks can read it in its entirety online, but I'm hoping, Kaylee, you can tell us just a bit about the paper and what it covers.
Sure. Okay, so the paper covers a lot of ground. So does our Unifor membership in industries, almost every industry across the country. So does our activism in almost every area that we could be advocating, and we do. So any recovery or any economic recovery plan has to be just as comprehensive as we are as an organization. The plan has two driving purposes. The first is to make sure that we have an economic recovery, that we prevent a further economic collapse and actually increase or speed up the economic recovery. And the second is to make sure that we don't go back to the economy that we had before and instead correct for all of the crises that were already there that Lana and Shane mentioned. Economic injustice, inequality, precarious work, climate change, the list goes on and on. So our team got together, we took this list, we brainstormed, we worked with lots of different departments across the union, and we broke down our recommendations into actually dozens. It's 5 categories, dozens of recommendations. There's no silver bullet to solving a crisis. We need work and effort across all lines. So the 5 categories are addressing income security through changes to EI and also building a higher floor, income floor, something like the CERB. We need stronger employment standards, sick days, the list goes on. Second, we need to rebuild the economy through green jobs and decarbonization, and that includes a targeted energy industry support program. The energy industry is going through intense amounts of upheaval right now that needs to be addressed. We also need to see a just transition plan, a green public transit plan, and then infrastructure for zero emissions autos and vehicles to be built in Canada, very important. The third is critical infrastructure. And we're not talking just roads and bridges here, though that is very important. We're also talking about expanding the definition of critical infrastructure to include the caring economy. And that's things like making sure parents have access to childcare so they can go to work. We've certainly seen the effects of not having childcare on the economy and on workers across the country in the last 5 months. We need to see housing affordability, for heaven's sakes, and the drinking water advisories on First Nations and Indigenous communities across the country. It takes money. We clearly have it. Let's just get it done already. We also need to look at making sure, well, Made in Canada matters. You saw that banner from Shane earlier today, and making sure that we have the industrial capacity we need to build the things that we need when a crisis hits. We saw very quickly that we did not have, as a country, access to the personal protective equipment necessary to keep workers safe. If we had not seen such a collapse in our manufacturing capacity over the last 20 years, more people would have been available to pivot and build the PPE, perhaps even have already been building PPE in the country. So we need industrial policy for auto, aerospace, shipbuilding. The list is long. Streetcars, subways, buses. The list is very long of the industrial policy we need. And then to include in that the creative economy and the customer service workers that were in high demand through government service support at Bell Media, Air Canada. Those workers went into high gear during this crisis, and if we hadn't seen the erosion of those industries over time, there would have been more people around in order to make sure we were meeting those demands as the pressure on our technical capacity was eroded. And then finally, if bailouts become necessary, and this crisis is dragging on, bailouts in some industries are already necessary, more will become necessary, we need to make sure that any government investment, the benefits of that are flowing to workers and not shareholders and executives. And the list of solutions we have for that is in the paper. So that's the substantial amount of coverage that this paper has.
So there are dozens of recommendations that are built into this paper. And as you've already explained, they cover a lot of policy terrain. Talk a little bit about the level of ambition here. If this paper and all of its recommendations sort of represent the end zone, where we want to get to, how far until Canada we can actually get there?
Man, that's a tough question to answer. The plan is incredibly ambitious. It's also very necessary. And we're in a time right now where crisis is creating opportunity to actually move us forward. So I'd say just in that regard, we're already a lot closer to the goal line than we thought we were. This pandemic has kind of created an opening for government to finally just rip the Band-Aid off of doing a lot of things we've been talking about doing for years. And that includes, changes to EI and new rules. The list goes on, but it all is about political will. And we saw that when government started creating these new benefit programs, that it takes an emergency and it takes political will. The polling that Lana mentioned earlier, 73% of Canadians expect broad transformation to come from this pandemic. I think that means we can be very ambitious and still expect to be very successful.
Okay, I've got 60 seconds left here, so I have to ask you this question. I can't let it go. Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister, a few months back, he takes to the Wall Street Journal, and he cautions against any big public spending during the crisis. He says, and now I'll paraphrase, that job growth and wealth creation will require more market activity and a bigger private sector, not more intervention and bigger government. Is he right?
It's very frustrating to hear those talking points. Canada and the rest of the world, we are in the most severe economic crisis since the Great Depression. What the government is doing now is preventing this from becoming the most severe economic crisis since we've been keeping track. There are a couple of very important points to make here. One, our understanding of how the economy works and what happens in this sort of crisis has improved and increased substantially as we've experienced previous crises, and has certainly changed since Stephen Harper's talking points were developed many years ago. We know that when the economy is not operating at full capacity, such as when we're all ordered to stay home to avoid a pandemic, more government spending and the subsequent economic activity is key to preventing further collapse. Two, the numbers that we're seeing in government spending, certainly eye-popping. Debt and deficit, these are all numbers that we never would have even considered 6 months ago. But without taking that debt on and all of that spending on, we would have all been falling through the cracks, and the crisis would have become much worse. Canada is actually weathering this crisis much better than most countries, and that makes a huge difference in how all sorts of private sector actors consider us when they're considering moving to us. And the one final thing is a big, bold recovery plan is the only proven way to prevent further collapse and actually accelerate economic recovery. We saw that with the New Deal in the 1930s in the US, certainly the economic recovery that happened during World War II in Canada. If we don't do the same thing now, we're just going to fall further behind.
All right, well said, Kaylee. Thank you so much for helping us set the table for this discussion. It's very much appreciated, and I know that you're going to be standing by for us in case we have to pull you back into the conversation. But what I'm going to do is transition now to our excellent four-person panel. As the panelists start to appear on your screens, I'll take some time to introduce them. Emily Coulter is a member of Unifor Local 1106. She is a proud mom of two beautiful girls, ages 6 and 9. And she is a long-term care worker, and she's been working in this field for over 15 years. So she joins us from Kitchener. Jessica McCormick is a director with the Fish, Food, and Allied Workers, FFAW Unifor. She works with Unifor members in Newfoundland and Labrador's fishing industry, which includes more than 12,000 fish harvesters and fish processing plant workers. She's in St. John's. Benoit Lapointe is our Quebec Council chairperson. He's also an airline worker. Benoit started working at Air Canada in 1997, and over 20 years he's held various elected union positions, including on the bargaining committee. And then finally we have Colin James, who's the president of Unifor Local 222, that's located in Oshawa, and is the first person of color elected president to the local back in 2016. Now, for those of you watching, our comms and our tech teams are working very hard in the background right now to make sure this all works seamlessly. And I'll apologize for everybody in advance for any delays in translation or signal interference. Just be sure to bear with us in case there are any glitches. Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's nice to see you all again. And thanks for taking the time to join in today. We'll go through an opening round of questions with each of you individually. And then what I'll do is a final round where we'll get you to offer up some big ideas on how governments might approach a meaningful economic recovery. So hopefully that sounds good. And I think, Emily, we're going to start with you. And frankly, I don't think there's a better place to start this discussion than in the healthcare sector, and specifically in the long-term care sector. I've seen stats that care homes represent something like 80% of all COVID-related deaths in Canada. And it's remarkable how unprepared and frankly ill-equipped these homes were when the crisis broke. As a worker, you've had a front row seat to these challenges even before the pandemic hit. So if you could tell everyone, like how did things get so bad?
I want to start by painting a picture of what long-term care looks like. The majority are seniors with underlying medical conditions and compromise. And we look at COVID-19 and we see that it goes after those that are most vulnerable. And then we look at the homes that they live in. And most of them live in these confined spaces. And you can almost see just how quickly the virus would spread from one resident to another. With so many residents and workers working and living in these conditions, it would be an easy path for the virus to cause outbreaks of massive proportions. coupled with slow reaction time, lack of PPE, dangerous levels of understaffing, poor infection control, and the constant changing in direction when it came to protocols in long-term care. These are some of the reasons why we got hit so hard in this pandemic. And it really goes to show that more should have been done to protect our seniors. This is something we could have lessened and prevented. It's not that we didn't see this coming. The crisis in long-term care, however, spans long before COVID-19, with a care deficit that left residents waiting for care. And it should have been addressed by all levels of government already. You know, what the pandemic did was expose the cracks in long-term care even further, stretching thin an already fragile system where worker and resident ratios didn't come close to the standard of care. What I can say as a worker working through the pandemic and a frontline worker with direct lines to the virus, you know, I've seen the changes in people in person. It changes you. I've seen the devastation firsthand of what this virus can cause. I heard their cries, and I don't want to get emotional here, but I've put some of my beloved residents in body bags, and I've taken them out of the building. You know, it leaves you feeling broken, and you look around you and you see the same sentiments shared by your friends and your coworkers, and we all have the same stories. You know, I'm angry at the situation. I'm angry that it got so bad, and more needed to be done, not only to protect our seniors, but for the workers that we're caring in all departments.
That's difficult to hear, I think, for everybody. But let me ask you, Emily, I mean, you're a worker, you're a frontline worker. In fact, you're one of the hundreds of Unifor members to have actually contracted COVID-19, and you've recovered, thankfully. You're also a mother, and childcare has been a major pinch point for workers, mostly women, who need to keep working. How have you managed all of these competing demands through this crisis?
I don't really know how I got through that time in my life. I look back now, and every day was different. My emotional and mental well-being wasn't solid at all. After coming home from work, you're exhausted, you're broken, you feel depleted, and all you want to do is rest. But you can't. The life of a mom is 24/7. It's a full-time job on its own. I'm grateful that my husband was there to pick up the pieces and was able to do more with my girls while I was isolated from them. Fear kept me away, and I'm sure all frontline workers out there can attest to, you know, the level of precautions we take to keep our families safe, because you don't want to bring it home. But I'm not alone. The majority of long-term care workers are women and women of color, all facing many issues, and childcare during the pandemic was one of the major concerns. To me, losing women in the workforce due to lack of childcare needs to be addressed in Canada. Actually, I should say all frontline working parents found that childcare to be one of the most difficult obstacles that they faced during the pandemic.
Okay, thanks so much, Emily, for that. And we're going to come back to you in just a little bit. But what I'll do now is I'm going to transition over to Jessica. So hi, Jess. The FFAW, we know, represents workers in Newfoundland and Labrador fisheries, as well as plant workers and others. These are workers in heavily seasonal workplaces. So COVID hits in March, just prior to the start of fishing season, and that puts incomes at severe risk. What were Unifor members facing at that time?
Thanks, Angelo. So in the spring each year in Newfoundland and Labrador, more than 25,000 people start moving around the province as the fishery starts up. So that's 10,000 fish harvesters, thousands of fish processing plant workers, truck drivers, dockside monitors, offloaders. And these workers were scared. Cases of COVID-19 were rising in the province, and many people were worried about how quickly the virus would spread in a rural community once people started moving in and out of these communities as the fishery began. And social distancing, is nearly impossible on a 30-foot fishing vessel. And it's equally as challenging on the line at a fish processing plant. And actually, in our plants, many of the workers there are women, and many of them suffer from a condition called shellfish asthma, which is a respiratory condition that is a result of ingesting toxins from processing shellfish. So they were more vulnerable as well. So rightfully so, people were very afraid of going back to work. And for those reasons, fish harvesters made the decision to recommend delaying the fishing season until May. And that recommendation was accepted by the federal government. It was absolutely the right thing to do, but it came with it so much uncertainty about where incomes would come from, how people would pay the bills if the fishery didn't start on time.
So employment insurance isn't available to these folks early on in the crisis, and CERB kicks in. The Canada Emergency Response Benefit initially, folks may remember, wasn't available to seasonal workers, and that included fish workers. So given the picture you've painted for us here and what we know about income security facing these workers, what happened?
Yeah, so and just to paint a bit more of the picture, in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, the fishery is one of the best jobs in town. And so, as you said, fish harvesters and plant workers are seasonal workers. When the pandemic hit, many of our members were either coming to the end of their employment insurance claim, which they receive in between fishing seasons. And for many of them, their claims had already run out. So they had no income coming in. And, before the pandemic, had expected to go back to work, and then they would, be able to start bringing in money and paying their bills. So when that didn't happen, these workers were kind of looking to the federal government to say, where do I fit in these new emergency support programs so that I have some protection? But as you said, at that point, we learned that the seasonal workers were not going to be eligible for the CERB. So we mobilized, and with the support of our national union, who have been in constant contact with the federal government advocating for these issues since the pandemic began, we were able to successfully lobby to have the criteria changed to the CERB so that seasonal workers, our members in fishing and fish processing, would be eligible for the program. And that gave our union workers on the ground the time and income security to focus on advocating for strong, standardized, safe operating procedures on fishing vessels and in fish plants once they went back to work.
Well, that's a good news story in a pretty terrible situation. So I'm glad that you shared that. Just before we transition to the next speaker, just a real quick follow-up. What does this experience tell you about the state of Canada's income security system today?
I think the pandemic has shown us that Canada's income security system is leaving many workers behind. It's exposed weaknesses and gaps in our social safety net. And especially in times of crisis, people shouldn't be expected to decode a complicated system in order to get the support that they need to make ends meet. And I think that we can't just plan for a crisis. We should be doing everything we can to build strong income security systems that support working people and prevent them from falling into a crisis to begin with. Whether it's EI, minimum wage, paid sick days, these programs need to be universal, accessible, flexible, and fair.
Okay, Benoit, I want to bring you into this conversation now. So, as I mentioned earlier, you work in the airlines industry, and this industry is among the industries most severely affected, I'd say, by this economic downturn. Tell us, how bad is it right now in the airlines?
Angelo, vraiment, comme tu viens de le dire, je pense que c'est une des industries qui a été le plus affectée par les pertes d'emploi, en tout cas temporaires. Là, on espère qu'elles sont temporaires. En ce moment, disons que l'industrie est dévastée. Il y a, si on prend juste, moi je proviens de l'Unitaire Canada, Air Canada, les vols fonctionnent seulement à 5% de leur capacité. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a 5% de vols qui continuent à opérer par rapport à ce qu'il y avait auparavant. 80% de nos membres sont en ce moment à travers le Canada, soit en mise à pied, ou sur encore une subvention quelconque là, qui est offerte par le gouvernement. Donc, et ça, je vous parle seulement de chez Air Canada, il y a plein de compagnies en ce moment qui sont complètement arrêtées. Hein. On a plus de 38 compagnies aériennes à travers le monde qui sont en ce moment sous la protection des créanciers d'une certaine façon ou d'une autre, là, qui sont sur le bord de la faillite. Alors, c'est sûr qu'au départ, les compagnies aériennes, vous avez vu comment on a dû se retrancher et puis fermer les aéroports. Sauf qu'au bout d'un certain moment, on espérait qu'il y aurait une remontée en juillet. On s'attendait à ce que certaines frontières s'ouvrent à nouveau. Et malheureusement, c'est pas arrivé. Donc, juillet est passé. Encore, on n'a toujours pas l'ouverture vers les États-Unis. On va en Europe au compte-gouttes seulement et partout en Amérique du Sud, en Asie, qui était un marché extrêmement important pour le Canada. Encore une fois, on se retrouve avec rien du tout. Alors, ce qui fait que malgré le fait que le gouvernement vient de prolonger la possibilité d'avoir la subvention au salaire, malheureusement, il y a des employés qui étaient qui profitaient de cette subvention, qui pourront tout simplement pas prolonger parce qu'à ce moment-ci, les compagnies aériennes commencent à se dire on pense pas pouvoir appeler la majorité des employés avant plusieurs mois, peut-être probablement plusieurs années. Alors, c'est assez catastrophique en ce moment, définitivement.
Thanks, Benoit. So let me ask you then, there is a very lively debate right now in Canada about what else government needs to do to keep the airline industry and other industries, quite frankly, safe from total collapse. We've already seen what an Air Canada bankruptcy looks like, and I know it's not pretty. What do you think? Should government step in this case? And if they did, what could that look like?
Absolument. C'est capital. Premièrement, et si on a juste à penser, essayez d'imaginer de quoi aurait l'air l'économie canadienne sans une compagnie ou plusieurs compagnies aériennes qui puissent desservir le pays. C'est impossible. On n'a qu'à penser à ce qui vient d'arriver. Vous savez qu'Air Canada a annoncé qu'il a coupé les vols à l'interne pour les petites régions, les petites villes, les petites destinations en région. Et ça crée vraiment des problèmes économiques incroyables parce que souvent, c'est leur seul moyen d'approvisionnement, c'est le seul moyen de se déplacer pour se rendre dans ces communautés-là. Un pays comme le Canada, grand comme le Canada, avec peu de population comme on l'a, avoir un système aérien fonctionnel et capital. On a qu'à penser aussi au cargo, au ravitaillement et tout ça. Alors oui, c'est certain, et on comprend la réticence de la population. Je pense que les citoyens, ils ont vu qu'est-ce que certaines subventions faisaient éventuellement, parce qu'on a subventionné des compagnies dans le passé. Le gouvernement l'a fait. Et souvent, l'argent ne sert pas à ramener nos membres au travail, à ramener les travailleuses et les travailleuses à retourner au travail. Ce que ça fait, c'est que tout simplement, ils s'en mettent plein les poches, on fait un petit spin-off et les compagnies disparaissent. Donc oui, ce qui est important, c'est absolument, le gouvernement doit nous subventionner l'industrie en général, mais avec des conditions pour s'assurer que l'argent va vraiment servir à la santé économique des compagnies, à ramener nos membres au travail. C'est ça. Et c'est ça le but d'Unifor. C'est ça, depuis le début, en fait, on a cette conversation-là. Et jusqu'à maintenant, on est le seul pays à travers le monde, je pense, si ma mémoire est bonne, où il n'y a aucune subvention pour le secteur aérien à ce moment-ci.
Okay, thanks, Benoit. Colin, I'm going to move over to you. Last but not least here, you are a very busy guy. I know this. You played a critical role in fighting back against General Motors' decision to end vehicle production at Oshawa. And in the context of this crisis today, how are things going on in Oshawa right now? How are things?
All right, just before I answer, I'll go back a little bit and review our recent history. So in November of 2018, General Motors made the announcement that they were going to end vehicle production and close the Oshawa facility. We mounted an incredible campaign. Our members gave us tremendous support to try and force General Motors to reverse that decision. The decision not only impacted 2,600 General Motors employees, it also impacted thousands of members in the supplier chain, as well as people in the community, truck drivers, mom and pop shops, restaurants, etc. We were not fortunate to reverse the decision. However, we spent 2019 bargaining agreements, closure agreements for our members to move on to the next chapter of their life. In addition, Two, we bargained an action center to help these members move on. Unfortunately, with the timing of the pandemic, the action center had to close down after a month and just recently opened again an appointment only. Today, we currently have over 200 members working in the plant on aftermarket parts, as well as 60 members making masks. So, I mean, we've moved on. It just goes to show our members again jumped at the opportunity to produce anything that's given to them and can produce quality products and are open to accepting any work.
No, for sure, for sure. I'll say it was pretty stunning to see the auto industry locked down for months, continent-wide, during the early outbreak of COVID. The manufacturing industry operates, as you know, as others know, on such tight global supply chains that plants very quickly started shutting down like dominoes. How did this early stages of the pandemic affect workers in the auto industry?
Well, in addition to members being laid off again after just being recalled to work, the pandemic highlighted just how tight the supply chain is in the automotive industry and how it could affect the economy overnight. This directly impacts workers and their families. And I think the crisis reinforced what we've been saying for years. Made in Canada matters. It's imperative that we have policies that do not allow other countries to hold us ransom, as we've recently seen with the masks. And we need to be self-sufficient and have strong manufacturing strategies.
Yeah, you touched on it with respect to the PPE shortages that we faced. I'd say that one of the things we realized in this country is that we didn't have enough of PPE that we needed. We didn't have enough of a lot of things that we needed, and it left plants like yours to convert production to making other things. In the case of Oshawa, as you said, it was surgical masks. What do you think this crisis has shown us about the value of having things manufactured in Canada?
Well, again, it shows us that we need to have policies that keep us self-sufficient instead of relying heavily on other countries. We have the facilities and the workforce to produce quality products, but we need governments to be bold enough to invest in workers. If we turn the clock back just a little bit, back to the 90s, we used to have a saying, sell here, build here, meaning, if you want to sell your products here, hire Canadians and invest in Canadians. Recently, we're just starting or just going into bargaining with the Detroit 3. And I think we have to make this an opportunity to have the discussions on building electric vehicles, be part of the discussion, create jobs for the next generation. We have an experienced workforce that's second to none. And again, our governments need to make bold investments into the future.
Okay, well said, Colin. Thanks so much. So what I'd like to do is kind of work backwards now. We've got a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask folks one final question and just get everyone's feedback on this one question. We'll start with Colin, and then we'll work our way back to Emily. And so I guess, as Kaylee explained earlier in her remarks, the Unifor Recovery Roadmap, it outlines a number of ideas to address many of the problems that each of you folks have raised very eloquently, I'll say. This is a very interesting moment for our country because it seems there's an opening now to discuss some of these big ideas and actually fix the longstanding problems that we've seen, we've noted in our economy. So very quickly, I'll give you 2 minutes each. If I were to ask each of you, based on your experiences, what are the 1 to 2 things you would have governments change right now to build back Canada stronger than before? And Colin, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I think it's imperative that Canadian content becomes a part of any public project that the government invests in, and we have to invest in workers. I think workforce has to be seen as partners, not adversaries, and with workers receiving their fair share of the pie. Together we can build a better Canada for the next generation. but we need bold governments to invest in workers.
All right, Benoit, same question. Over to you.
Des chemins. Et les planètes sont un peu alignées. Hein. On a un gouvernement qui est quand même assez ouvert à ces discussions-là et je pense qu'on peut réussir à faire entendre. Moi, je pense qu'avant tout, c'est important que le gouvernement, oui, investisse dans les travailleurs et les travailleuses, mais s'assure que la sécurité soit améliorée pour tout le monde. Et quand je parle de sécurité, je veux dire de sécurité financière dans le sens, on parle toujours d'un programme pharmaceutique. Je pense que c'est capital à ce moment-ci. Et un programme aussi de garderie fédérale à ce moment-ci. Parce que, bon, au Québec, on a la chance d'en avoir un. Mais on voit d'ailleurs au Québec la différence que ça a fait au niveau de l'économie pour les familles. Les femmes ont pu prendre d'assaut encore plus le marché du travail et on se doit d'avoir un système comme celui-là qui est offert partout dans le pays. Je pense que c'est une des choses sur lesquelles il faut travailler le plus.
Thanks, Benoit. So Jess, over to you. One or two things. What can we do to make things better than before?
Well, the EI reforms that were announced yesterday by the federal government, that is probably would have been my answer 48 hours ago. But now that's a huge victory for our union and for working people across the country. There are changes that Unifor has been advocating for long, even before the pandemic, a reduction in the qualifying hours for EI, and a new benefits floor of $400 per week, and a benefit to replace the CERB, which is about to be phased out. That's going to make a huge difference for so many working people. So make no mistake, that is a giant leap forward, but I don't think we can stop with just that. Our EI system still needs a major overhaul, and measures like the ones that were announced yesterday must be made permanent if we want workers and future generations to benefit.
All right, and Emily, over to you. You can close things up for us here.
Lots of recommendations for the government, but I'll stick with these two. I'd like to see for-profit in long-term care phased out, and there be a standard of care when it comes to long-term care workers, and the ratio that it comes to a resident to a worker, and that the government move from a medically based assessment for needs to a hands-on care for seniors in long-term care, and bring Canada under the Canada Health Act. Second, which will be beneficial for me and for any parent out there, would be a universal childcare for all that's built into the Canada's infrastructure, where parents can have that opportunity to have safe and reliable childcare and continue to work and build a stronger economy, and that there be a healthy balance between work and home life.
That's very well said, Emily, and that's an excellent way to close off this panel, I think. Maybe what I'll do, if she's still hanging around in the background there, we've got a few more minutes. I'd love to bring Kaylee back and even just to kind of grab any thoughts and observations she has on the panel that we just had. I'll see if that's possible. No, okay, we can't get Kaylee back. Boy, this live TV thing is very difficult. It's hard to navigate this. So anyways, we will certainly hear more from Kaylee as time goes on. And I'd say thanks to all the panelists, thanks to Emily, thanks to Jessica, Benoit, Colin, and obviously Kaylee for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. I thought that was a wonderful discussion. I think a lot of the terrific ideas that we heard are all also thread through the paper that we have. I feel as though Unifor has a roadmap. We've got a blueprint in terms of how we do this, how we see a brighter light at the end of the tunnel. We just need governments to take hold of this moment and use it to build the kind of economy that workers need. What's promising, and I think Jess hit it right on the head, what's promising is that some of these conversations are actually starting to happen, and we saw this yesterday with some very bold and ambitious moves on reforms to EI. These are temporary reforms, but again, I think the next objective is how do we make these important changes permanent? We certainly cannot let this opportunity slip away. We have to be vocal, we have to be active, as Lana was telling us, and we have to leverage the power that workers have to affect change And I know we can do this. And on behalf of Kaylee, on behalf of the full research department, we look forward to working with all of you to make this happen in the years to come.